Welcome back to Conversations at the Leaky Cauldron, episode 16, with our starting now today with our 6th edition of the 7th edition series, Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. Back with me are my esteemed colleagues, Miss Sarah Miller, Mr. Wesley Schantz. Welcome back, you two.
Oh, howdy.
Greetings. It's good to be back.
Good to have y'all back, and I can't believe we're already to the 6th edition of this series, of the 6th part or component of the series, moving quickly towards 7th, though these last two books are mammoth. So, maybe it's like a Fibonacci sequence. It's like when you think you're done, you've just begun. And so, we have these 4 chapters ahead of us. They are The Other Minister, Spinner's End, Will and Won't, Horus, Slughorn. Do you all want to start with the Other Minister? Very interesting there that we see a Prime Minister, we see a Minister of Magic, we see an interesting interplay, we've seen a change of leadership. We now have not just Cornelius Fudge, but a former Auror. His name is escaping me right now. It's something like Clinchjaw or something like that. I recall who plays him in the movies, but did y'all want to start with that first chapter?
Yeah, definitely. I thought it was really interesting. Was it just in the last book where we start at the house of the Riddle family? Am I getting that wrong? Or is that just the last one? Anyway, I thought it was like sort of similar because we're sort of seeing things from the Muggle perspective to start off. And I thought that was really interesting that, the perspective that we start this book with yet again is not that of our main character. We only sort of shift over to Harry after we get this kind of cinematic, opening. And this one is a lot more humorous in some ways, but it does have, certain overtones of dread, not unlike the start of that 5th book.
Yeah, I'm not sure how the 5th book starts. I thought that the zooming into the house was in book 4 when he kills the gardener. But yeah, I think I really liked the opening 2 chapters just because it didn't introduce us right to Harry and Dumbledore and Hermione and Ron. But I did think the stakes are a lot higher now, and so high that the Minister of Magic has to reveal himself yet again. It seems like it sounds like he's been having to visit the Muggle Prime Minister more often than he ever thought he would. And I thought that was it was funny, but it was like an effective way of sort of recapitulating where they've been, but it wasn't as plainly expository. And I think, like I said, I think it makes it clear how high the stakes are, given what happened at the end of book 4 and what happened at the end of book 5. That it's affecting the whole world, right? Like this, to the point where even Muggles are experiencing the sadness that comes from, Dementors. The Muggles are confused as to what's going on. I thought that was just highly effective, I thought.
That's right, and you're now helping me to recall. So it was book 4 where we got the beginning of the Riddle House. The beginning started with the Riddle House, the beginning of evil, as it were, or darkness. But the 5th book started with the Dementor being sent, which we later find out was by a Ministry of Magic official, Dolores Umbridge. And so it's very interesting to me that we see not only the minister and the new minister. I looked up his name, Rufus Scrimgeour. What a wonderful name. Very powerful name. Reminds me also of another Rufus we know, Wes. But what did you think of the fact that he is an Auror and that he has replaced Fudge and has such a different temperament? It's almost like a Julius Caesar type, or a Dwight D. Eisenhower is being brought in for the combat. Do you think that was a good move? And also, I guess I would add to that, I note a parallel not only with the stakes being high because of seeing the ministers, the Prime Minister and the Minister of Magic, unclear who the other minister truly is, and also Dumbledore getting directly involved and finally going himself into Harry's home and deciding that he will himself be giving lessons to Harry, and we'll be explaining more to Harry, more of what the story really is, just to tie into the theme of last time, or the last few chapters of the last book, when he gives us that new perspective on what's happening.
I mean, go ahead, Wes. No, please. Okay. I can go. I sort of thought of Rufus Scrimgeour, or I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. He's described as a lion, or looking kind of like a lion. I sort of saw him as like a wartime consigliere, like when when a country's in crisis, the person that they look to might not be someone who is philosophical, but might be more of, say, like a military leader. I think the fact that he's an Auror, and he seems like pretty to the point. He, at the end of that chapter, he says, like, I probably won't, I'll be too busy fixing things and handling things over here. I'll just dispatch my aide, or my consultant to be your, basically to brief the Muggle Prime Minister on what's going on. Just like, he seems a little bit more all about business, and a little bit more direct, maybe even blunt than Cornelius Fudge. Their names are, to me, like, they sound kind of like the difference between the two characters. The name Cornelius Fudge just has, I don't know, it sounds like there are trappings to power with somebody with that name. And the Rufus Scrimgeour just really seems kind of like somebody who gets brought in off the bench to, like, clean shit up, or right the ship, right? We'll later learn that he has some, like, Creon-esque tendencies that in a time of crisis, he is capable of justifying, like, curbing certain liberties and freedoms for the sake of security. And I'm also pretty persuaded that that's not necessarily always the best plan, though it is always tempting. I mean, that happened after 9/11. It happens whenever a country is in crisis. I think it makes sense that people would look to somebody who they see as having a proven record of like a battle, but it also was somebody for whom, politics isn't necessarily their forte, with somebody for whom maybe, like, legislation isn't their forte, but, like, military. It seems kind of like the Aurors are like their police, basically. And so, as I understand it, there isn't really like a military analog. Maybe that's it, but that, there's chain of command, and you do what I say, and even if it's uncomfortable or if you don't like it. And I think that he's kind of got that dimension to him. I know that will be maybe more obvious in the 7th book than it is in the 6th, but that's sort of what I thought about that.
Yeah, Wes, what'd you
I thought it was so interesting how we get this kind of political perspective along with the Muggle perspective, and so we're, like, sort of inside the head of the Muggle Prime Minister, thinking about, like, his pity for Fudge, actually, right? And that's so interesting because Fudge is not a real attractive character to us as readers of the past few books. But I think you can really see, like, he's been kind of bowled over by a lot of these events, and he has taken it actually relatively well. It seems like he sort of still wants to, return to power somehow. Seems to be his kind of angle here. Like, he's made some miscalculations with respect to Dumbledore and Harry Potter, but, if he sort of plays his cards right, he could still kind of sneak back in because he knows that Dumbledore doesn't really like Scrimgeour, so he's still sort of calculating. We get that sense, and it's interesting because that political component of the world building is one that we've kind of been curious about all along, right? Like, how the magical world and the Muggle world, interact. And so we see this, like, little insight here, the magic painting on the wall that can't be removed. That sort of link is there. it's like part of the room itself, which is interesting. And each prime minister doesn't tell anyone for fear of being thought insane, right? So that the weirdness of the magical world is its like greatest protection, like its greatest means of staying secret. I also really like that we never hear who the president is that's supposed to call. It's like we sort of are teased with the thought that there's this like connection to the United States. That's what I assume, of course, but I don't know. Like it could be the president of anywhere, I guess. But instead of that other, special relationship or whatever, we get this the magical one intervening here. And I probably said this about a few of the other books, but like I don't remember this book well at all. So Scrimgeour is like completely a blank in my mind. I do not remember what he does or why he's not pals with Dumbledore. I can sort of guess based on what you just said, but I'm really curious now to like see how the political thing kind of plays out.
I wonder to what extent that's sort of a joke as well, right? Because you were saying this is undiscovered territory or terra incognita for us in the Wizarding world so far. We were wondering about the interplay not only between the Muggle world and the magical world, but between the magisterial Muggle world and magical world. And the very last people to be doing something about the presence of the Dark Lord and to have learned about his presence are the politicians. And so I wonder if it's A, making fun of them, and B, also illustrating the importance of a sort of a massive and slow to move and potentially dim-witted political system. That just recently I've been reading a book by Francis Fukuyama called the Origins of Political Order or something like that. The Origins of Political Order. And he says that the thing about tribal societies as opposed to state societies is that they're subject to decay very quickly because of internecine rivalries between themselves. It reminds me a bit of the giants that we saw in the last book. But whereas a state, precisely because it's sort of a big dumb cyclops, tends to stay together a little bit better, just because it is so slow to move. And so I wonder if there's like the shallow sort of funny point there, but also the sort of deep comment on the political. I also noticed that you mentioned the painting being connected to the room in a very sort of Odyssey sort of way, in the same way that the olive tree is the cornerstone of Odysseus' house and is literally a poster on his bed so that it is immovable, the marriage bed that he shares with Penelope. And so there's some sort of marriage connection here, just like in Paradiso 32, there's a metaphor used, a simile describing the perfect fit of the people there as ring on finger. And so I like that you're laying down the marriage motif. I think that that's a big motif we've talked about without talking about. And so, Sarah, did you want to comment on that, or do you want to jump into this Spinner's End and this new relationship we see between Sissy, and Bellatrix, and Bella, and Snape?
I was super interested in that chapter. I didn't really have anything else I wanted to add to the like your sense of political commentary in the first chapter. But let's move on. Let's dive in.
And so what did you think about the relationship, the closeness between Bellatrix Lestrange and Narcissa Malfoy? And also this sort of, I don't know, did you think that it was sort of like the relationships we see between Draco and the two kids, which we will later see very interestingly? It's interesting to see Snape talk as a peer. Also Bellatrix, who you really don't ever get to see as like a person in the movies. She's always just sort of like a demon force of evil, like the evil Mary accompanying the Luciferian Voldemort, or I guess the image of sin. But what did you think of that unbreakable vow that was made and what was asked of Snape and how he talked and Bellatrix's opinion of him? Or what were you interested in that chapter too as well?
I thought I was mostly interested in the way that Snape answered all of Bellatrix's objections, all of her questions of his loyalty. You know, we know what we know about Snape because we've read all the way through the series, but I think this is maybe the first time in the series where, if you haven't read all of the books, this is a frightening vision of a version of events from Snape's perspective. Like, because what if what he's saying is true, right? I think the other thing that that I was super interested in is, we know that Voldemort is this incredible, has this incredible capacity for reading minds, and I think we sort of talked about this when we were reading about Harry's occlumency lessons with Snape. But if what Snape is saying is true, and that he has answered all of these questions to the Dark Lord to his satisfaction, then I just think it's really remarkable that the degree to which he's able to exist in both of these worlds. And I think when I read this for the first time, I didn't know how things would turn out. I didn't know that Snape would be redeemed. That his words to Narcissa and Bellatrix in the end of the epic, it would turn out that this is all like a gambit that he's playing with them. Even the unbreakable vow, that this is all a play, right? I think that that's just remarkable acting ability, especially from someone who doesn't really seem like he has full control over his emotions at times, right? To have to kind of exist in that world. I think the place where he lived sounded just really lonely, and like the physical area, the neighborhood. I think Bellatrix makes a comment that, like, you know, none of their kind live here. It's like a poor, kind of small little village hamlet. You know, in the movie, it's shown to be really humble, and it just the loneliness that must come from playing both sides, I think, is also what struck me. But I'll just leave that there and let you all go.
Oh gosh, yeah, there's a lot in this one. I think seeing, again, sort of like seeing the other perspective, right? And so not the Muggles this time, but the Death Eater perspective, and seeing it in like a human way, right? Because Narcissa is so concerned for Draco that she's willing to talk about something that she's been told not to talk about with anyone, right? So she's really actually kind of disobeying Voldemort to try to protect her son. She's going against Bellatrix, who's like one of the most fearsome, duelists that we see in the whole series. So she seems pretty fearless here, and pretty admirable, actually, right? Like I sort of sympathize with her, and by extension with Draco, who's clearly like gotten mixed up in something that he never really chose, but just because of who he is and who his parents are, he's kind of like apparently gonna have this huge responsibility, and we can already sort of see the outlines of what that's probably going to be. But it is interesting how ambiguous everything is left, right? Even when the unbreakable vow is made, it's not made in like very strict legal language, right? It's in very sort of opaque and vague kind of mythical outlines. And so if you know anything about these kinds of fairy tales, like whenever you like agree to make a vow, it's going to be something that you aren't really expecting, but it's going to be sort of open enough that you can find a way to do the right thing even within a seemingly strict vow, right? So there's this kind of give and take there of a really old kind of magic, right? We've kind of heard about like there's sort of degrees of magic, right? And this looks like that kind of older, family type, or Alex, you mentioned the marriage thing. It has the sort of outlines of that. They clasp hands. There's a witness, and they, like, by means of a promise, are like affecting a real change in the world. Yeah, I found this chapter fascinating, and just the title of it, The Spinner, that image has a ton of, you know, mythic resonance as well, which is interesting to sort of think about how to kind of apply in this case. Sort of like a tale teller, right, is a spinner of tales. I think that's the primary way that I think about it, but I'm curious to hear what you think too.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And it just made me pick up my copy of the Aeneid, what you were saying about opaque language and a prophecy, or excuse me, and an oath being something that can be exploited, especially in like sort of, like you said, the Jinn and Aladdin type stories. But it made me pick up book 3, the penultimate stanza of Virgil's Aeneid, where he talks about for all the prophecies he's seen, he still gets hit with his father's death out of nowhere, as if regardless of how much you think you know, there are still major holes going on. And this will only take like 10 seconds, but then Drepanum's unhappy coast and harbor received me. It is here that after all the tempests of the sea, and that's metaphorical for everything that's happened to him, I lose my father, Anchises. Stay in every care and crisis. For here, O best of fathers, you first left me to my weariness, alone, Anchises. You who were saved in vain from dreadful dangers, not even Helenus the prophet, nor the horrible Celaeno, when they warned of many terrors, told this grief to come. And this was my last trial. This was the term of my long journey, and I left that harbor, and then the god drove me upon your shore. So that was just the connection that I made to what it was you were just saying.
That's awesome. I was not familiar with that. I mean, I haven't read that in years, but that's cool.
Yes, Sarah.
I liked the kind of the image of there being a kind of wedding or marriage. I thought it was interesting how you pointed out that that this is something that, you know, we've hated Draco Malfoy for legit reasons for the last five books, but like what's being asked of him is because Voldemort is angry with his father, and I don't know, that gives me a little bit of pity for the boy. Not a little bit, like that gives me a pretty sizable amount of pity for the boy. And I think kind of complicating our view of what constitutes good and what constitutes evil, like Narcissa Malfoy is a Malfoy, right? They're like in the Death Eater camp, right? But are there different, is it possible that she's there because she married the wrong guy? Is it possible that that there's like degrees of bad, that like her sister and Narcissa are not in the same, really even in the same category? You know, what Narcissa does is, we've seen a good mother in the series already. We've seen a mother who's, you know, willing to risk life and safety for the sake of their children. And we'll see that again in Molly Weasley. Like, we've seen some bad moms, right? Like Petunia. I absolutely loved Dumbledore's indictment of the Dursleys to their face. Yes. But like I think there's something to be said for humanizing someone like Narcissa Malfoy as a way of maybe amplifying what exactly makes the evil of Voldemort evil, right? That it's not just like, oh, they're all on this side, right? And I think that's maybe the thing that like a battle captain or somebody like Rufus Scrimgeour, whose entire experience that puts him in a position to be Minister of Magic is, you know, battling, rooting out dark wizards, right? Like, is that a nuance that somebody like him is going to be able to see? Maybe, maybe not, right? Like, an Auror has maybe kind of a pretty clear goal, like find dark wizards and put them in jail. Well, like Narcissa would qualify, but here she is, and she doesn't seem as evil as her sister. She certainly doesn't seem as evil as like the commander of the Death Eaters. Like, I don't know. I think it's an important complication. But I had never really thought about like the wedding imagery that you guys are pointing out. I guess it'll be interesting to see, because this book does sort of pick up on a lot more like teenage romance than ones in the past. And there's already a reference to like an impending wedding. I don't know if we read through that part. Did we read through phlegm or no?
Well, I certainly heard that bit, but I think also just to that marriage motif, just pairs that go together and are opposite. Something that picks up here too is our knowledge of the distinctions in sort of blood that have been mentioned over and over again since I think book 3 or so. We've known about mudblood and pure blood, but now we have a book called The Half-Blood Prince, and then we learn, I think a little bit later from Ron, that even though his house is pure blood, they are so-called blood traders. I'm not exactly sure I understand why they are blood traders, but that is considered even worse than being a so-called half-blood or mudblood. And just interestingly, of the half-bloods we know now who are big-time names, those would be, of course, Harry and Voldemort. We don't yet know to whom this name refers, and perhaps it does refer to just those two or to 3, but it's the choices as well that people make, like you mentioned, Sarah, that seems to be dividing them along differing lines. Draco seems to be denied this choice because of the actions of the father. It's like his father is Cain, and he's like Tubal Cain, and like the trespasses of the father are visited unto so many generations onto the son, sort of Old Testament-like. Whereas we see Dumbledore even being capable of forgiving major flaws and faults and mistakes even within one's own life. So we see that the camps are based, with, again, Voldemort being able to read people's minds on finding their flaws and their faults. And if you look at Lucius too, and the sort of Death Eater way of being, modus operandi, even in the actions of the youngest one, Draco, their way of looking at the world seems to be to find the flaws, like a very snake-like way. They don't see the good in things. It's like they've understood the manifesto on luxury, to use but not enjoy. But I guess I'm just wondering whether we see that division too. Not only are we getting more about what makes a person in terms of blood and what the importance of that is, but how, even with that understood, choice is still the most important determinant in this world.
Yeah, I think, to jump ahead a little to the Horus Slughorn character that we meet,
yes.
He seems like a really interesting sort of variation on that theme of, he's got his love of connections with powerful people, and his love of being sort of the spider at the center of the web, right? So like the spinner again. But he's also imploring Harry to not think him prejudiced, right? Like, because he, I think, can already see that to get to Harry, he's going to need to at least appear to be much more open-minded and to be sort of, forward thinking or something like that. And that seems to be part of Dumbledore's tactic here too, right? To like dangle Harry in front of him as a way to get him to come back to the school, to strengthen and shore up that long, weak spot in the teaching lineup, which is the Defense Against the Dark Arts class, right? So that's very interesting how, Harry is pretty obviously being used by Dumbledore, and it doesn't really seem to bother either Harry or Slughorn that much, right? They're kind of okay with it. And it does seem to be because we know, like, Dumbledore is authentically that open-minded, sort of compassionate person, that he can kind of get away with doing that here, it seems like. Whereas we don't really know much about the Slughorn guy yet, except that he seems to be a coward. He seems to be really looking out for number one. And insofar as he helps others, it's to sort of like stoke his own ego and his vanity. But on the other hand, he seems to be a pretty talented, wizard, and to be like quite important, like historically, which is again like going along with politics and perspectives and stuff. History seems to be kind of becoming more of a big thing in the background here. So yeah, I mean the idea of blood, it has a kind of history to it. it has a kind of vitality and authenticity to it. It's a very charged image and very hard to sort of pin down. But he's got like dragon blood splattered on the walls, and he like collects it again to reuse later. It's a little dusty though. I love that line.
Yeah, Sarah, what do you think of this Slughorn character? Were you grossed out by him? What were your feelings about him? I feel like he was a bit overdone and creepily made in the movies. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just going to say it's a little hard for me to separate the Jim Broadbent of the movies. And because of what we know he has done or what he hides. I think Wes is absolutely right. When you identify like his self-interest, I think that's presented as pretty ugly. I think the other thing that I see in him is like really old school, like kind of the old boys club, like the please don't think I'm prejudiced, but I actually am, right? That's like saying, I don't mean to be sexist, but women really can't do this as well as men. Or I don't mean to be sexist, or I don't mean to be racist, but like, please don't think I'm racist when I just said something racist, right? Like that kind of like complete lack of, what it indicates to me is that he's been out of the game, right? Like that is so out of touch. And I think it's like you said, Wes, it's selfish, but I think it's also just really, lacking in awareness that the idea that like, I'm not prejudiced. One of my favorite students was Muggle born. It's like saying like, I'm not racist. I have a black friend, right? Like that to me, it just, he appeared so like old and like myopic and like out of touch. And again, maybe I'm reading a little too much into that because trying to take seriously, I think the way that this has applications for like our contemporary world, but like he seems really like backward. And I think the obsession with fame is interesting because, in the second book, and this is the second to last, you have another character who's obsessed with fame. In this case, Lockhart was obsessed with his own fame, and Slughorn is obsessed with what he gets or who he knows, right? He's not offended that Amelia Bones was killed. He's offended that like with all of her connections, she wasn't safe, like that. Ew. I find him like, if he's not evil, like actively, this kind of attitude perpetuates it, or it certainly allows it to fester. I think that there's certain kinds of people who are better than others, but don't judge me for thinking that, right? Like, not there are certain ways in which people are better than others at things, but that there are people in this on this planet who are inherently have more worth because of something over which they have no control. And I think that kind of belief, it's manifested differently in Slughorn's worldview, but it's not that different than a Death Eater, right? That like there are certain kinds of people who are good and certain kinds of people who need to be eliminated, right? And again, these are kinds of being for people like Hermione over which they have no control, right? You don't have control how or where or to whom you're born. And any insinuation that like that I don't know. Anyway, that's what I thought about Slughorn. Maybe that's not what you were anticipating, but
that's interesting because it makes me think of, and I'm forgetting the name of the particular devil in Paradise Lost Book 2, who it is. I can't remember whether it's Beelzebub or Belial, but there is a sort of hedonism devil, a devil from the East who likes nothing more than being sort of Dionysian and likes luxury and soft light and, you know, comfortable corners. And so I guess I'm interested in Slughorn. A, his name, Slughorn. B, his desire to collect people and things and be like the spider. C, the fact that he was head of Slytherin and is, like Snape was, a potions master. Does that mean that he's supposed to be good at cooking up schemes or brewing up trouble or something like that? I guess I'm just, why is he so soft and gentlemanly and charismatic? Because, again, that's just something that we'll hear from Mrs. Weasley later, that he could be charming when he desired to. But he's sort of cold and calculating in his decision-making. What did you think about this just very different portrayal of something that's potentially evil, Wes?
Yeah, no, I like the connection back to Paradise Lost for one, but to like Gilderoy Lockhart from the second book. I think that's really apt. I think another person we're supposed to be thinking of here is probably like Dolores Umbridge, right? You know, he's akin to her in some respects, although he seems to be a bit more sophisticated, you know, in his predilections to vice than hers were. He's I think an overdone and sort of grotesque character in some ways, but in other ways, like the politics considerations in the very beginning, he does sort of represent like a higher level of complexity when you're sort of going about your self-interest or something, right? Like he doesn't want to be out there in front of the cameras the way that Lockhart did. He doesn't want to be sort of like obviously ascendant in power the way Umbridge wanted. No, he wants to sort of just pull the strings and get to have that kind of gratification and be safe and sort of greedy, but not too greedy. You know, he's like sort of smart about how much he wants. He can pick up and move at any time, you know, because he needs to sort of stay under the radar. So he's a real difficult sort of opponent, and I think someone that you would also want to be wary about having as a friend. So it's sort of like it's a real tricky thing to figure out quite what to do with him, right? Like everyone's sort of non-committal when they try to describe him to one another, or when they try to decide if they like him or not, right? They sort of make these in-between sorts of noises because it's very hard to and very dangerous potentially to be too sure about him one way or the other, which actually makes me think of Snape too in a way, right? You don't really want to be either on his good side or his bad side. You just kind of want to avoid getting too close to him at all. I think as far as like Slytherin goes too, it gives you sort of another look at what Slytherin might have used to have been, right? When back in the good old days or something, you know, that's sort of like the mode that they were operating under, which is, you know, sort of a kinder, gentler, but still like harsh and, you know, efficient and ambitious, but in a different way. Yeah, I find him very, very interesting. Plus, like I said, his like the way he's presented, it's like, oh, we're very tense. Like, is he killed? Was he, you know, kidnapped? Or, oh no, he's just like hiding in the form of a overstuffed chair.
Yeah, and so Sarah, yeah, well, I mean, so do we want to keep talking about him because he is sophisticated and difficult to pin down, and he does strike us as the way things used to be, almost as if he is like a comment by Rowling on like the boys' school, Oxford wearing gentlemen's club people, that which seems harmless, but ultimately because of what it ends up allowing can be you know, a gateway to ultimate evil. Well, I think
that's exactly how I see him, is that he's this vestige of the past, and that, yeah, like maybe on its own is like benign-ish, but that because he's a power broker, or sort of fancies himself one, and because he takes delight in what he can get out of that, like at the end of the day, what does he really stand for? He stands for himself and the preservation of his own comfort, and those people are not necessarily always to be trusted. They may be predictable, but like not necessarily predictably on your side, right? And like he, you know, and again, this I'm speaking. We only saw him in this one chapter, right? But we'll learn more about him later. But just like the ability to kind of like, oh, it's not, you know, like he sloughs off responsibility for certain things. I don't want to be there. I'm not going to, you know, I don't want to be out in front, or when he doesn't want to like serve the school. He doesn't want to draw attention to himself, but it's not because he's humble. It's because he's scared. Right. And just the abdication of responsibility. You know, what I'm reminded of is, Alex, I think it's in the vestibule of hell in the Inferno. It's the people who pursue their own interests, the indifferent, or the what are they called?
The neutral.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes, the neutral angels, the ones who refuse to take a stand.
The people who refuse to take a side but they're also, there's like a pope in there in addition to the angels, and they're like, they have, in my view, one of the more like ugly and graphic punishments. And I know that in Dante's Inferno, it's not as though the deeper you go, the more grave the sin, the more graphic the punishment. But the punishment is supposed to fit the crime, and you know the real punishment is witnessing your crime turned into your suffering or whatever. But that like the way that they are forced to chase like an elusive banner for the rest of their lives, and they are like gnawed at by these bugs, and there's like pus and blood and all of this and this is before you even like get into hell, or this is like just when you walk in, right? They're not even really a circle because they didn't ever really do anything. But like that's kind of part of the problem, that like when I was teaching that book, I sort of would ask the students, okay, well, like why are they here? Like why are they at the start, and what is it about the other sins that they allow to happen? And like that was the idea, that like indifference breeds other kinds of bad behavior. And if you are indifferent because it's in your best interest, or if you are kind of like looking out for number one, and so sometimes you do the right thing and sometimes you don't do the right thing, but you can't really say it's the right thing if you're just doing it for yourself, right? I don't know. That's sort of how I see it. I think it is an indictment of kind of like the old way, right? Like wash my hands, kind of the status quo of the past. This is how we've always done it. It's in my best interest to preserve that, right?
And
anyway,
and you make me see another correlate. So as I said with Belial in hell in books 1 and 2, we have this quote here from 490 to 502. Belial came last, than whom a spirit more lewd fell not from heaven. And this is our last potions teacher, right? Or more gross to love vice for itself. To him no temple stood or altar smoked. Yet who more often than he in temples and at altars, when the priest turns atheist, as did Elias's sons, who filled with lust and violence the house of God. In courts and palaces he also reigns, and in luxurious cities, where the noise of riot ascends above their loftiest towers, and injury and outrage. And when night darkens the streets, then wander forth the sons of Belial, his parties at night, flown with insolence and wine. Witness the streets of Saddam that night in Gibeah, and the hospitable Dores yielded their matrons to prevent worse rape. And something interesting about the word Belial from the Hebrew is that it's not an official god or angel name. It's the name of sort of a decadence. And so it's personified by Milton. And just to, again, further support your point, Sarah, in book 2 of Paradise Lost, when Belial shows up to speak second, 106, he counsels no war, but not because he wants peace, but because it's easier. On the other side, up rose Belial, in act more graceful and humane. A fairer person lost not heaven. He seemed for dignity, composed and high exploit. But all was false and hollow, though his tongue dropped manna and could make the worse appear the better reason. And that's interesting, connected to the potions he will show us later, like the luck of luck. the Felix Felicis, and also the love potions, to perplex and dash Maturus counsels, for his thoughts were low, to vice industrious, but to nobler deeds timorous and slothful, yet he pleased the ear. I think those are lines 109 to like 118 or so. Yeah, so I agree. And I'm sorry I'm quoting so much today. You guys are just making me think. We're making some real connections. Maybe
I love it. I love it.
Maybe maybe Slughorn is teaching me or teaching us the spider's craft, and that perhaps how Minerva differs as a spider herself, or a maker of spiders through the figure of Arachne, is that, the greatest threads are those of, I don't know, thought that can be connected through something beyond time and space, even more than just being humanly connected. It's as if that is the connection between humans which is strongest, because it is the ultimate way that humans can connect. And that's sort of the difference between a beautiful connection or a friendship of the good, as Aristotle would say, where you sort of share your intellect and your will in similar noble pursuits, and sort of this gross Slughorn, Joe Biden patting people on the back sort of way, where it's so obviously for his own, and I didn't mean to make fun of Joe there, but it just popped in my head. But it is so obviously for himself. He is enriching and fattening himself. And I think it is important also that he is described as fat, right? That he takes up a lot of space, that he's very, very comfortable. And that, more than anything, that's what he wants to maintain. And that's sort of a pathetic or an atheistic way of living, like a godless way of living. Even it makes me think also of the sphere or circle 6 of the Inferno, where Epicurus is amongst the heretics. Sarah, though I think your example was obviously better. But Wes, do you want to comment on that, or what should we end on? I know we didn't talk about will and won't very much, and I frankly don't remember the chapter very well, so I might need a refresher.
I was just looking at that to try to get a little, so like the Dursleys are sitting there because Dumbledore puts their couch underneath of them. He seems to want them to overhear everything and sort of be up to speed on everything, and makes it clear that he knows how poorly they've treated Harry all along, and that's not okay. And as soon as Harry is of age, he will be out of their hair, but until then he needs to have the protection of the house and the blessing that Dumbledore laid on it, or sort of unlocked, that was always there, or whatever it is, right? And I think the will and won't primarily maybe refers to Creature, who appears and confirms that Harry is indeed the owner of the Grimmauld Place residence, and thus the secret headquarters of the Order, And so he says, I won't, like he won't do what Harry says, right? He refuses to serve, but then of course Harry gives him an order, and he has to, because that's how magic works, right, for house elves. And he sends him to be one of the friends of Dobby and Winky up at Hogwarts kitchens, to kind of keep him out of trouble and make sure that they're looking after him there. And so there's a lot of kind of new info here, but maybe the most interesting, right, is that Dumbledore is sort of like an active character this time. He's got some kind of wound on his hand that seems mysterious and interesting, but he won't tell us because he wants to do the story justice, and he's gonna, I guess either this or the next chapter we learn, he's gonna do some private lessons for Harry, which is pretty cool, and very much the opposite of how he was treating him during the last book. So yeah, it's great. It's a great sort of vindication of Harry, and revitalization of his relationship with Dumbledore here.
And at some personal expense to Dumbledore, as you mentioned, he shows his vulnerability. It's as if the old wise king archetype, as the Jungians would say, of Dumbledore is starting to show its cracks. It's going to soon have to die and be reborn in a fox sort of way, a Foxian sort of way. And I think that'll be very that'll be very interesting to see how that unpacks itself over time. And let's see, I had a second point here too, but talking about Voldemort's vulnerability. Yes, the household elf situation and how that connects to the theme of both family and how family is generated, and also to sort of ownership and freedom. This is an elf who will still technically be owned and has transferred ownership from one master to another, who was not technically family of him, right? He was his sole heir, kind of like Frodo with Bilbo, but in The Hobbit, but also he's not blood related to the Blacks. And in fact, he's a half-blood, but now he is the master of this elf who he doesn't free, but he does send to work for Dumbledore, which strikes me as Harry understanding elves, and that would have been a big slap in the face, I think, to Kreacher, even though obviously what are Kreacher's options here? Either be disgraced and freed or serve a half-blood. It's a real skill and Charybdis situation for him. And like you said, he's saying won't in this non-serviam devil-like way. He's like a pathetic figure of the devil, right? He's ill-intentioned, but it's precisely because he, like Wormtail, is underestimated that he can do so much evil. So you're bringing up, I think, the multiple ways evil can manifest, and the sort of like work together in an evil constellation. Like there's a differentiation of labor even within an evil organization. But also the idea that family, like at some point people have to be able to join a family at some point in order to like sort of merge blood. And the notion of Harry joining Sirius's family, even though now all of the family is gone, except for now, ironically enough, Bellatrix Lestrange, who he has some sort of relationship to. They didn't know who the house would pass to, but it passed to Harry, meaning that, by some sort of right, he has greater claim, by some deep magical right, he has greater claim to 12 Grimmauld Place. And again, we'll see the marriage motif with Flem and Bill, and the joining of a family together. And it's almost as if that's part of what fighting the darkness is about too. And that's something the Weasley mother will bring up later on, that during these dark times people marry more and quicker, and that's sort of interesting. And so that's just what I wanted to mention, that we see those the family motif and the ownership and freedom motif as well through what you were saying, and of course will and won't, very, very clearly about freedom of will there. Sarah, was there anything in there that was good, or what did you think of will and won't?
Well, I mentioned it earlier, but I loved the way that Dumbledore, I think we mentioned this last week when Harry was just ragging on him, like just erupting in rage. I think one thing that struck me is that it's only been a couple weeks since the end of that book, like in terms of chronology, but Harry's anger is like radically shifted, right? He even says that he felt guilty for like shouting at Dumbledore and breaking stuff in his office, and then said something which I thought was a little glib, like, oh, Sirius wouldn't want me to be angry. And I'm just thinking, like, 2 weeks? It just took you 2 weeks to come up with that? Like, that didn't feel authentic to me. But maybe she just needed Harry to not be that. She did it so well, I thought, in the 5th book, presenting like an emo kind of morose teenager with a lot of anger and feelings that he doesn't know what to do with, that like maybe she just needed the 6th book to move on to a different kind of dimension of adolescence. But I thought one of the things we said last week was how well Dumbledore took it, and how like he could have just snapped back at Harry and said, like, respect your elders, you little brat. And I think of all the things I've done for you. But he also could have been a lot more cruel to the Dursleys, but he is the picture of civility when he visits, and he to the point where he's like, I assume that you were going to offer me a refreshment, but let me conjure one for you, or I assume that you're going to let me sit in your living room. And I just like the way that he chastises them, I think is just so interesting. Like the way it to me, it's what really effective, like, moral instruction looks like, is like yelling at people. I mean, especially kids. I know we think about this on a daily basis because of our work, but like yelling doesn't work. At least it doesn't work reliably, right? And I think what it can do is damage relationships and trust more than, and occasionally it's highly effective, right? But it's just not the most effective way to communicate like genuine disappointment in someone's failure to be the best version of themselves. And like the way that he calls them out, I thought provides them an opportunity to redeem themselves, though I think they probably won't choose it. But it seemed, I don't know, it in that moment he emerged, at least not that he already was, that he wasn't, but he emerged to me as like extremely wise, and like tempered, I guess. You've never treated Harry as your son. He has known nothing but neglect and often cruelty at your hands. The best that can be said is that he has at least escaped the appalling damage you have inflicted upon the unfortunate boy sitting between you. Right? Like, which I thought was hilarious, right? Like that they've done damage to Dudley, and that, you know, neglect, at least they didn't ruin Harry or something like that. But yeah, I thought that was moving, because one of the things he reveals at the end of the 5th book is how much he loves Harry. And with Sirius gone, I think what we see Dumbledore kind of transition into, especially with these new classes, they'll be spending time together. Harry will have some privileged information. He'll see Dumbledore as weak, right? As weekend, at least. I think Dumbledore moves into kind of a fatherly figure for him in these moments, maybe more so than he has already been. I think he's been so distant and maybe so powerful that it's hard to see him as fatherly, like in a proximate or imminent way. But I think that's sort of what this lays the groundwork for, is like a mortal Dumbledore, one who loves, one who isn't as quick as he used to be, one who and the good things that come with that mortality or that weakness, which is an ability to have relationships. I think previously, and something we'll learn about Dumbledore later, is like the loneliness that comes from being so powerful and so successful. Now he sort of like partners with Harry in a way that I think is kind of cool. I also think, just as something we talked about a while back, a lot of really important details in the 6th book are given like little teeny tiny mentions in the first few chapters, like Madame Rosmerta's need and the Inferi, like those bodies that can be bewitched. There's a couple other moments where just like a little hint is dropped to world build that I don't remember seeing it that much in the 4th and 5th book, but it's definitely back. So that was cool.
All right. Well, that's excellent. So I guess if I were going to ask you all questions, and this jumps a little bit ahead to Slughorn's first class, which potion would you be most interested in having access to that he shows us? The Draught of the Living Death, the Polyjuice potion, the Felix Felicis or Felicis, and the Love potion, the very powerful one. Of those 4 potions which he brews up, which I wonder if those are supposed to be like the rhetorical arts or something, like the fake arts or something like that, fake transformation, which would you be most interested in having a vial of? And what would you use it for?
Man, that's tough. Those are all sort of like breaking the rules in various ways, aren't they? Right? They're sort of like him offering them this temptation to transgress and to do it under the auspices of the authority figure. Like, that's so creepy. I think, like, to go from least creepy to I mean the Felicis one, it seems like the least bad to choose. But on the other hand, like the living death thing or the love potion, those are so overpowered, right? Like you could wreak a lot of havoc if you were a Fred and George type character with one of those at your disposal. But no, I'm just gonna have to say the Leakus one, because everyone has bad days. That could really help you out on one of those kind of down, depressing sorts of days.
How about you, Sarah?
That's a good question. I had the similar reaction as Wes, that like they all sort of cut a corner, right? And you get the pass to cut a corner. I think Veritaserum is one of the things in that
is
in
it?
that chapter. Is that right? Yeah.
So maybe he talks about living death later, or that's what they have to actually produce in order to. Okay.
Yeah, I think so. But anyway, I mean, I think that there's one that's about truth, there's one that's about love, there's one that's about chance, and there's one that's about death.
The mystery.
Right. I guess if I had to pick one that I could have, and I think Polyjuice Potion is in there as well, that I could have, I think I would probably go for, I don't know, I think we learned that the Polyjuice Potion is pretty disgusting to drink. Like it's pretty yucky, but I don't know, maybe the ability to like masquerade in somebody else's body does feel like a little bit, like that feels wrong, but it might be kind of cool to see the world from somebody else's perspective. I think the one that I would absolutely not want is like the love potion, just because I think even though I think it's funny what it makes people smell, I don't know, it seems like that's one thing that, and maybe the Veritaserum too, but like they both seem to violate somebody else's will, whereas the Felix Felicis and the Polyjuice Potion, they don't really seem to violate somebody else's, I don't know, brain. I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know. I don't have a good answer.
That's interesting, though, because you're making me think that what the Polyjuice Potion does is makes you sort of mimic inappropriately having the perspective of someone else. And I was thinking about the Felix Felicis, which is certainly what I would take this time, because it sort of alters causality against other people. It sort of gives you an unfair advantage against others. And so it does impose on them insofar as they come in contact with you. And I was thinking about that and how
That's fair.
Yeah, like if you're lucky, especially if you're competing in something or other, this is why it's banned for these reasons. You're going to come out better than the people around you, but that just won't end up working out for you in the long term either. You can't just keep winning. As we know from Jock Panksepp and his work on rats, even with rats, you have to win only 66% of the time to get a smaller rat to keep playing with you. But interesting how we're seeing these. I like the outline we have of Slughorn. I can't wait to think about each of these potions in more detail. So for next time, would you two like to go through 10 to 11? I think that's a 10th one. I just had it open. I think that's where we meet the Gaunts.
Oh, sure. So 5 all the way through 10. Yeah, I can do that.
Sounds good. Cool.
All right. Until next time then. Bottoms up, y'all.
Cheers.
Cheers. Have a good night, fellas.
See ya.